Hello and welcome to the Gaggle Wobble Challenge, and if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I want to do a short podcast on President Trump's apparent reversal of his position or attitude towards the war in Ukraine. It took place yesterday, it was Tuesday, following his address at the United Nations General Assembly. So, as you know, for most of the past, we'll say three plus years, President Trump has been insisting that Russia is winning this war. Obviously, he's been saying that this war would never have happened had he been president. He's been saying that it's an absolute disaster for Ukraine to have got itself into a war with a much stronger power, and that Ukraine really doesn't have too many cards to play. And whatever the shape of the final settlement will be, Ukraine will have to make territorial concessions. So Trump has more or less been adhering to this position at various times. He has spoken reasonably well and understandingly towards Russia. But at other times, he's expressed some irritation with Ukraine and Ukraine's insistence on going on waging this hopeless war. And of course, all of this culminated in that train wreck of a meeting at the Oval Office last February. But during all this time, Trump has continued to say Ukraine will have to make territorial concessions. Biden and Zelensky, he says both Biden and Zelensky were very foolish in pushing for this war that could only have one conclusion, namely Russian victory. But yesterday, Trump seemed to reverse himself. And he seemed to think that Russia is fighting very poorly and that Ukraine can indeed win this war. Not only can Ukraine win this war, Ukraine can win back all of the territory it lost um, really since 2014. In other words, he thinks it can restore the Ukraine within its 1991 borders, and he went beyond that. He said Ukraine can take additional territory inside of Russia, which is quite a remarkable transformation. Because if you recall, only a few months ago, he was pleading, sending out truths to Russia's President Putin to spare the lives of the Ukrainian soldiers who were stuck in Kursk. He said these soldiers stuck in Kursk are facing annihilation, and he was pleading with Putin that he spare their lives and allow them to leave. So now apparently he says no, Ukraine can actually take territory inside of Russia. So it's not easy to understand exactly why Trump has reversed himself, what information he suddenly has acquired that has caused him to change his position so utterly, or what he's hoping to accomplish by making these statements, because the implication, quite obviously, is that the war needs to go on. Where before he said this war is hopeless, Ukraine will have to make concessions. That means but the war needs to end, because the longer the war goes on, the longer this hopeless war goes on for Ukraine, the more territory it's going to lose, and therefore the more concessions Ukraine will have to make to Russia in the final peace negotiations. But if you say that, well, Ukraine can win this war, and that Russia is really quite rubbishy as a military power, then that the obvious implication, the policy recommendation coming out of that is that the war must go on, and the United States must go on supporting Ukraine in this endeavor, something that he had quite obviously uh, pledged to end. This was exactly the kind of war in which America had no stake in, and that was obviously contrary to American interests, and that America needed to bring this war to an end. So now it seems to the implication is otherwise. So let's first of all take a look at what happened after the the kind of a brief um, conversation that President Trump and Zelensky had at the United Nations. Trump is having many meetings with many world leaders on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly meeting. So they had a kind of a brief exchange, and there was a short news conference that followed. So let's first see how Trump responded to some of the questions at the news conference. Um, okay, so here it is.
Mr. President, that NATO country should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter their airspace? Yes, I do.
All right, so that was quite a blunt statement. Should NATO shoot down Russian aircraft that enter its airspace? He says, yes, I do. Now, of course, it's a quite wild and ridiculous statement because everything really depends on the particular circumstances. I mean, if it's first of all, you absolutely have to be sure that a violation of airspace has taken place, and then you have to be sure that this was intentional or this was inadvertent, and you have to be sure that it was done with some hostile intent. Um, uh, Before you start shooting anything out of the sky, and therefore obviously killing Russians, you've got to be sure about a lot of different things. Because if you shoot aircraft out of the sky because it, traversed NATO airspace by, a couple of feet, and then you kill some Russians, then you are risking retaliation. And then if you're risking retaliation, then of course that will raise the question of, well, what's NATO going to do about it as a whole? And of course, that means what's the United States going to do about it? And therefore, what's President Trump going to do about it? So by just giving the sort of cavalier response, well, yes, I do, just shoot them down if they violate NATO airspace. The United States is asking for a great deal of trouble in the future. So that was the first question, and we'll come to that in a minute. The NATO's whipping up this hysteria about Russian intrusions into NATO airspace. This has been quite ridiculous. It's been going on now for the past 2 weeks. There was even a UN Security Council meeting about it. So, given the hysteria that's being whipped up, Trump, by making this response, yeah, NATO should just simply shoot down Russian aircraft, is essentially just pouring gasoline on the fire, because the war hawks within NATO would love nothing more than to provoke a war with Russia, a war that, of course, they themselves, all the Latvias, Lithuanias, Estonias, and Poland, Finland, they themselves cannot possibly fight this war against Russia. So they're essentially looking to the United States to fight this war for them. Trump should know this. And so for him to say, yeah, shoot it out of the sky means, yeah, in no time at all, he could have on his desk a demand that he make a decision to hit the Russians. Anyway, so that was the first question. Let's go on.
I'll let you know in about a month.
President,
So there we are, the usual question. Do you trust Putin? He gives the response, I'll let you know in a month. We don't know why he makes these uh, decisions when a month, 2 weeks. There's always some point he's going to tell you that whether he trusts someone or he doesn't trust them. And again, it's a stupid question because that's not, there's no point in, you don't just trust anyone or not trust them. That's just not the way international affairs works.
Trump, your message to the.
Will provide Ukraine with the security guarantees to the same way as European allies. Later down the road, we'll be talking about that. Hopefully, we'll be in a position to talk about that a little bit later on. It's a little bit too early to answer.
Why do you think Mr. Putin is not willing to meet with both of you?
President Trump, your message to President Orban, who is refusing to stop buying Russian oil.
Well, he's a friend of mine. I have not spoken to him, but I have a feeling if I did, he might stop. And I think I'll be doing that.
Thank you. What progress?
So here, there's a question about, he's not president, he's Prime Minister Orban. He's saying, Orban will stop importing oil from Russia if Trump asks him to do so. Well, that isn't going to happen. Hungary depends on its imports of crude Russian oil, and its refineries are geared towards Russian crude. Refineries can't just be transformed to take other kinds of crude. So that, they would have, Hungary would have to build brand new refineries, a hugely expensive enterprise. Hungary doesn't have the resources for that. The alternative, which is to transport oil by truck from the Adriatic, arriving in Croatia, and then taken by truck into Hungary, that is a hugely expensive, labor-intensive, a very difficult operation. So Hungary is not going to make a decision to end its reliance on Russian crude, and particularly not given that Hungary's never had any problems with the deliveries of oil from Russia. So why would Hungary end its imports of Russian crude? Well, for the sake of Ukraine. Well, what does Hungary care about Ukraine? Hungary and Ukraine do not have very good relations. We've discussed that many times. There are all sorts of reasons why not. Hungary is also very much opposed to the NATO project in Ukraine. He thinks that was a wholly misconceived undertaking. He thinks the sanctions against Russia was wholly misconceived. And why exactly should Hungary sacrifice itself for Ukraine? It makes no sense. But Trump says, "Oh well, I'll talk to him and I will persuade him." Well, I don't think so. I mean, it's more than Orban's political life is worth, because if he tries to cut himself off from Russian crude, then energy prices will in Hungary, which are already quite high, will quadruple, and that will bring his political career to an end. Anyway, let's go on.
Been made on ending Russia's war against Ukraine since the last time you saw President Zelensky?
Well, the biggest progress is that the Russian economy is terrible right now.
So this is the first thing. This is when, and we'll come to that when he talks about it in his Truth, that the Russian economy is doing terribly.
Ukraine is doing a very good job of stopping this very large army. Pretty amazing. This is a war that should have ended in 3 days, 4 days. People said it was going to be very quick, and you got to hand it to the Ukrainian soldiers and everybody involved. It's still going on, and that's not a good thing for Russia. This was supposed to be quick, and so Russia doesn't look very distinguished, having taken 3.5 years now. 3.5 years of very hard fighting, and it looks like it's not going to end for a long time.
Mr. President, have you been briefed on the latest alleged drone incursion into Denmark? What do you think of that? And
Where?
Into Denmark, Copenhagen. Denmark is saying that there were some drones that shut down an airport, possibly Russian sabotage. What's your response to that? Will the U.S. have a material
Well, I
response
have
to
no
that?
response until I find out exactly what happened. I know about it, but they don't know what happened. But we're going to find out very soon.
So we'll talk about this in a second. This is part of this ongoing hysteria about Russian incursions into NATO airspace. That Denmark claimed that there were some drones that interfered with air traffic control on Tuesday morning. And right away, they started putting, particularly by the demented prime minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen, suggesting that maybe Russia was behind this. They had no evidence whatsoever that Russia had anything whatever to do with this, but this is now de rigueur within NATO, is to suggest anything at all. It's always Russia that's behind this. But immediately it comes up here.
Would you back up NATO allies? You said that you thought that they should shoot down the Russian aircraft. Would you back them up? Would the United States help them out in some way?
Depends on the circumstance. We're very strong toward NATO. NATO stepped up, when they went from 2% to 5%.
Now, notice here, having first said they should shoot down Russian aircraft out of the sky, at the moment any NATO member state decides that, Russian aircraft are intruding into our airspace, just shoot them down. And then, it's a reasonable question. Okay, so what's the United States going to do then? I mean, are you going to back them up? Because Russia may well retaliate. You're going to back them up? Well, it depends on the circumstances. So Trump first declares, yeah, absolutely, go ahead, shoot them out of the sky. Okay, are you going to back up Finland? Are you going to back up Lithuania or Estonia or Poland? Are you going to go, you're going to be there? Because that's what, they're not just going to go ahead and shoot down Russian aircraft unless they think that the United States will be in their corner in the event of Russian retaliation. And they said, well, it depends on the circumstances. So as always with Trump, you got to, you take your first comment, but then you look at his second comment, which kind of calls the the thrust of the first comment into question. Shoot them out of the sky. Are you going to back them up? Well, depends on the circumstances. Yeah, depends on the circumstances. Which is why you don't start shooting stuff out of the sky unless you know exactly what the circumstances are. Just simply saying, oh, it's an intrusion into airspace, so we just shoot it down. That's not the way to go. And that's why Trump's first comment was obviously just pouring gasoline on the fire and giving ammunition, so to speak, to these some of the most belligerent war hawks in NATO land.
That was great unity. Trillions of dollars is being pumped in, and they're paying us for the weapons that we sent. But that was a big day. That nobody thought a thing like that could happen. You had countries that weren't paying 2%, and now they're all paying 5%. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of weapons they're buying, and they're buying them from us. They're buying them from the U.S.
All right, so this is familiar Trump talking points about we've gone from 2% to 5% and so on. But then after this presser, he sent out this very lengthy truth about the war in Ukraine, and let's take a look at what he said there. So here we have, this is the truth, very long. He says, after getting to know and fully understand the Ukraine-Russia military and economic situation, and after seeing the economic trouble it is causing Russia, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. So right away, there are all sorts, that's just the first sentence. There are all sorts of questions that arise. First of all, he says, after getting to know and fully understand. So what happened? What new piece of information, new analysis was presented to him that caused him to change his mind? This is exactly the opposite of what he had been saying. And then it says, seeing the economic trouble it is causing Russia. Now, Russia does have economic problems, as do other countries, but nothing of the scale of some economic trouble. It's just, there's no evidence of that economic trouble. But then he says, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. So what stands out right away from that sentence, he says, with the support of the European Union. He doesn't say with the support of the European Union and the United States. He just says with the support of the European Union. So you just go right ahead to the EU and support Ukraine. You know, keep at it. But it's striking that he's talking here about the European Union, but doesn't mention the United States. But then he says it's a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. That's a very radical statement, because no one has really made that claim. You could say that implicitly that's been the NATO agenda, the Biden-Blinken agenda, that they're going to restore Ukraine to its 1991 borders. But they haven't said it explicitly, that's the objective. But I mean, so here Trump is now saying explicitly what NATO has hesitated to declare, to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. Then he says, with time, patience, and the financial support of Europe, and in particular NATO, the original borders from where this war started is very much an option. So again, what he says, with time, patience, and the financial support of Europe, and in particular NATO. So again, he seems to be shuffling off this responsibility onto Europe. Now, he does say in particular NATO, but the way he's framing things, remember his great plan, his great innovation is that NATO will continue to arm Ukraine through the purchase of arms from the United States. So when he says NATO, he doesn't quite mean NATO including the United States. It's rather he's saying NATO, the European member states of NATO, who will purchase arms from the United States. So again, he's saying time, patience, the financial support of Europe, and in particular NATO. Again, he's shuffling it off onto Europe rather than taking on the burden for the United States. So the original borders from where this war started is very much an option. So again, this goes beyond anything NATO has said. A very drastic program, wholly different from what he had been saying, up until just a couple of weeks ago, that Ukraine is going to have to give up territory. I mean, he's actually said explicitly in a number of statements that Ukraine will have to give up territory. Now is made this reversal. No, they can get all of their territory back. But, and this is where it gets, they can get their territory back just relying on the Europeans. Yeah, the Europeans can do this. We will help, of course. We'll help the Europeans. They can buy their military equipment from us. But essentially, he shifts the burden onto Europe. So then he says, is very much, he says, with the original borders from where this war started is very much an option. Why not? Russia has been fighting aimlessly for 3.5 years, a war that should have taken a real military power, less than a week to win. Well, all right, we don't need to discuss the military strategy of Russia, but why would it take less than a week to win? I mean, Ukraine was a big country. It's by territory, it's the biggest country in Europe, next to the Russian Federation. But by population, it's among the bigger countries of Europe. It had serious military armed forces at its disposal. In 2022, NATO had been active in Ukraine from 2014. We know this from former Secretary General Stoltenberg, that this is what NATO had been doing during this time. And to say that less than a week to win, where does that come from? The United States spent 20 years in Afghanistan and failed to win. And Afghanistan is certainly much less of a military power than Ukraine was in 2022. The United States was in Iraq for a good long time. Also, took a lot of time to accomplish its goals. Vietnam also it was a very long military presence, took a long time, and the United States failed to accomplish its goals. So this declaration that should have taken less than a week to win, I mean, it's kind of childish. I mean, leaving aside, whatever mistakes Russia may have made in fighting this war, but just simply saying, they should have taken less than a week to win, it's based on nothing at all. This is not distinguishing Russia. In fact, it is very much making him look like a paper tiger. So it's clearly going out of his way here to try to be as insulting as possible to Russia, which again is contrary to his previous respectful tone that he had towards Russia. So they're making him look like a paper tiger. When the people living in Moscow and all over the great cities, towns, and districts all throughout Russia find out what's really going on with this war, the fact that it's almost impossible for them to get gasoline through the long lines that are being formed, not clear where he gets this thing about it's impossible for them to get gasoline through the long lines that are being formed. This has not been confirmed by anyone about these long lines for gasoline. And all of the other things that are taking place in their war economy, where most of their money is being spent on fighting Ukraine, which has great spirit and only getting better, Ukraine would be able to take back their country in its original form. And who knows, and this is where you're going, and who knows, maybe even go further than that. So here he's kind of issuing essentially a threat to Russia. Well, maybe they can go even further than that. They can take territory away from Russia. Quite how a power that is at best about a quarter of the size of the Russian Federation can take territory from the Russian Federation. That's not, that doesn't quite, remains inexplicable. I mean, it's like, if you're 4 times the size of another country by population, by industrial resources and everything else, by the military and so on, hard to see how they could just take territory away from the Russian Federation. And in particular, he saw what happened in Kursk. I mean, they tried to do that. They invaded Kursk. And it was Trump, who started pleading with Putin, spare the lives of the Ukrainians who are stuck and encircled in Kursk. So this is really equivalent to his issuing these threats. Trump is a great one for issuing threats, So he's now threatening Russia that, well, who knows? They may even go further than that. They'll get all of their territory back, including Crimea. So they'll get Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson and Zaporozhye. They'll get back Crimea and something more from Russia. Well, these are quite remarkable statements because Lugansk, 98% in control by Russia. Donetsk, Kherson, Zaporozhye, about 70% controlled by Russia. Crimea, 100% controlled by Russia. So it's very hard to see quite how you can get all of that back. And the only additional assistance that Trump is offering is that somehow the Europeans are going to do it. They're going to provide assistance, and they're going to purchase arms from the United States. So Russia was able to take all of this territory at a time when the United States was providing a considerable amount of weaponry. So Trump isn't really offering any huge boost in weaponry. In fact, he's not really offering anything very much. So it's just unclear how they're going to get all of this territory back. Not to mention they're going to take territory from Russia. And then he says Putin and Russia are in big economic trouble, and this is the time for Ukraine to act. So there it is. This is the time for Ukraine to act. So it's basically telling them, yeah, you go right ahead. There's no more diplomacy, no further need to bring this war to an immediate end, which is what he's been saying all this time. They can just go ahead and act. Just go for it. So okay, that's quite a reversal. All this time he says, I got to bring this thing to an end. I got to bring this thing to an end. No. Russia's in terrible trouble, and this is the time for Ukraine to act. They should make their move, take back all their territory, and indeed take territory away from Russia. And then he ends, in any event, I wish both countries well. We will continue to supply weapons to NATO for NATO to do what they want with them. So that, in other words, he's continuing with that weapons program. We will continue to supply weapons to NATO for NATO to do what they want with them. Good luck to all. So right away, you have to wonder, what was behind this. And here is TASS, which obviously the Russians weren't exactly very happy, given how cordial and courteous the Russians have been towards Trump. And so here's TASS that says, Kremlin slams the idea that Ukraine can regain any lost territory as wrong. And here's the Peskov. The idea that Ukraine can reclaim anything is wrong, commenting on statements by US President Donald Trump that Kiev can use military force to regain all its territories and return to the 2022 borders. The spokesman said, the situation is different now. Ukraine's position is much worse now. I repeat that they will only continue to deteriorate. The fact that Ukraine is being encouraged in every way to continue hostilities and the idea that Ukraine can win something back is, in our view, a mistake. And then there's another statement from the Kremlin. Kremlin slams Trump branding Russia paper tiger. And it says here, Russia is not a paper tiger. It's closer to a bear, while paper bears do not exist. Russia is definitely not a tiger. After all, Russia is more often compared to a bear. There are no paper bears, and Russia is a real bear, the Kremlin official said, commenting on US President Donald Trump's remarks branding Russia a paper tiger. Now, as I said, these comments of Trump are really quite strange. I mean, first, obviously, that it's not clear what the evidence is that he's basing this on, but also it seems like a complete reversal of all the things that he had said in the past. And as I said, his previous position was Ukraine cannot win this war. Ukraine's not doing well. Ukraine has no cards to play. Remember this? He made that point to Zelensky in that fateful Oval Office meeting. You don't have any cards to play. So what he's saying here is exact opposite. Now, one possible source of this strange declarations by Trump is General Keith Kellogg. I mean, Kellogg, if you recall, was going to be his point man on the war, and then he kind of got demoted, but was never really fired from the administration, and so he became a kind of a nurse for Zelensky. He would constantly be going to Ukraine and encouraging Zelensky, providing reports to the media about how fantastic Ukrainians were doing and how terribly the Russians were doing. So here is something that Keith Kellogg said very recently. Let's take a look.
Days, Biden gave them everything. If he was winning, he'd be in Kiev. If he was winning, he'd be west of the Dnieper River. If he was winning, he'd be on Odessa. If he was winning, he would have changed the government. Russia is, in fact, losing this one. Now, they may make movements. It seems, well, they're advancing in the Donbass region and Donetsk. But if you consider advancing moving by meters, not miles, well, then, okay, that's successful. But if the cost they're having, it's enormous. And I don't think people truly appreciate it. It's a number. With the numbers they have lost, when you're talking dead and wounded, well over 1 million. They left Afghanistan after losing 18,000. We left Vietnam after losing 65,000. They lost over 1 million dead or wounded. These numbers are World War II level numbers when you think about it. They're stunning in the loss. And this is and their first line units that they came and tried to take Kiev with a little before 4 years ago. Those first line units are gone. So they've gone through a second and a third or fourth iteration of wartime commanders. They're pulling tanks out of mothballs, out of museums, put on the battle line. They can't operate in large movements because.
All right, so you get the sense of it, and Kellogg has been making all sorts of statements like this for some time, and as long as he's around and Trump hasn't fired him, he's demoted him, but he hasn't fired him, he's having some influence. And Kellogg actually boasted that somehow that Trump asked him what his view of the war was, and I told him that Russia's losing this war. Ukraine is winning this war. He was boasting about how he told Trump when Trump asked him his view. So I think he's having some influence on Trump. So the question then arises, has anything changed? Is Trump planning now to escalate the war? Is Trump now planning to increase deliveries of arms for Ukraine, or is he just simply shuffling off responsibility onto the Europeans? Or indeed, one can say, Trump is very mercurial. Is Trump likely to change his mind and then go back to his original position? Maybe by the end of today, but definitely next week or next month. It's very hard to know. There's nothing in the message, and there's nothing in that he said in the that very short presser with Zelensky that suggests that Trump is about to escalate American involvement in Ukraine and American support for Ukraine. He's talking much more about the Europeans. He's passing this on to them, and that, hey, you know, I think Ukraine's got a great chance. You just go for it. It's like you're encouraging somebody else to fight and say, yeah, I think you've got a fantastic chance of beating the heavyweight champion. Just go for it. Don't listen to the naysayers. Just go ahead and do it. So, I think that seems to be the more likely view, because so far Trump hasn't given any promises of any major U.S. escalation, and even of deliveries of arms. He's basically steady as she goes. Hey, NATO can go on purchasing weapons from us, and then they can do whatever they want with them. And they want to go on fighting, let them go on fighting. That is something he's also said in the past, which is we should just let them continue fighting. The tone of his comments, both in the presser and in the truth, is calculated, I think, to insult the Russians. But that's who Trump is. I mean, Trump is somebody who likes to insult and likes to threaten. And I think that could well be the case here. I mean, obviously, he feels that he had these good relations with Putin, and he thought that Putin would like him, and once they had a few phone conversations, they actually met in Anchorage. Putin would just simply say, you know what, most important thing for us is good relations with the United States. Let's just wrap it up and end this war. And maybe Trump had some expectation that this is what would happen, and it hasn't happened. And so he's now venting his rage at this. So at this stage, yes, it looks like a major reversal on Trump's part, on at least his position on the condition of the war. But it may be little more than just simply traditional Trumpian bluff and bluster and threats, because so far he hasn't promised any additional U.S. Military hardware, additional U.S. intelligence or whatever. At least he hasn't done so in public. One can say that at the very least, none of this is very helpful. If Trump really wants to end this war, then the simplest way to do it is to end it. And you end it by essentially saying that the United States will no longer go on supporting Ukraine. It can be done. He could have done this on January the 20th. He hasn't done it. This is just dragging on and on. And so when he makes these kinds of declarations, and thereby giving false hope to Ukraine, false hope to Ukraine's European allies, it only emboldens the war hawks, and it only ensures that the war continues. It doesn't ensure that Ukraine can win. I mean, Trump has failed to outline any kind of a program of how Ukraine can get all this territory back, including Crimea and including taking territory from Russia. I mean, it cannot happen. But by doing this, by making these kinds of statements, he is encouraging the war hawks. He is letting people believe that maybe at some point down the road, the United States will be ready to commit itself militarily to fighting Russia in Ukraine. So he's giving hope where there shouldn't be hope. The only hope there should be is for peace, and that means to bring this war to an end. It's within Trump's power to do so. He hasn't done it, and making these kinds of statements, sending out these truths, only makes the attainment of peace that much more difficult and that much less likely. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye-bye.